Hi, and thanks for listening and watching this seminar run by Leeds IAPT, that's Leeds Improving Access to Psychological Therapy Service. My name's Martin Groom and I'm a cognitive and behavioural psychotherapist with the Leeds IAPT team. This is one of 3 seminars which are available on our website for people waiting for cognitive and behaviour therapy. We've created these seminars for 2 reasons really. One is to help people prepare for their CBT. Quite a lot of research demonstrates that if you know what to expect from your CBT and you understand what's expected, you're more likely to make the most of it. And the other reason we've written these seminars is to give people who are waiting for their CBT some ideas and some tips in terms of how they can cope, or really how they can start their CBT before they start their CBT, if you like. So in the session today and across the other 2 sessions, we're mainly focusing on understanding what keeps problems of anxiety and depression going, and then building on that understanding to give you some change methods or ideas or techniques that you can use to start feeling better and coping better. So this seminar is called Do What Matters. It's particularly relevant to coping with low mood, such as what happens when we get depressed, and it's equally relevant to whether depression or low mood is your primary problem, the problem that you're seeking help with, or whether it's the secondary problem. So by that I mean perhaps you've been feeling anxious or worried for a long time. You may be having panic attacks, or perhaps you've got a diagnosis of obsessive and compulsive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. But after that's been going on for a long time, it's likely that you'll start to feel low or depressed. So if we look then at the aims of the session, what we're going to try to do in the session today is try to understand how sometimes life events can get in the way of doing what really matters to us. We're going to learn about avoidance goals and how these can lead to a cycle of distress and low mood. We're going to introduce ideas and methods to break out of these traps or cycles and try to get back on track, and by that we mean kind of back on track with our lives. Accompanying the seminar is a booklet which is also called Do What Matters, and you can either print this off or order a hard copy. Follow the instructions on the website or in the writing on this YouTube channel to find out how you can get hold of that if you haven't done already. Now, we cover quite a lot of different ideas and methods in this seminar, and they're all covered in the booklet. So I'd encourage you as you go through this, rather than keeping a lot of notes, to focus really on just trying to absorb yourself in the information and try to understand it. See how it fits in with your situation or your life. The way these seminars are designed is a bit like a smorgasbord or a hotel breakfast. They cover a lot of different ideas and a lot of information. It may not all be relevant to you. So by that I mean it, when you go down for your breakfast in a hotel, there's lots of different things to choose from. Perhaps there's cereals, there's croissants, there's porridge, and there's also the kind of full English option. Now the idea isn't that you necessarily eat all of it or have a bit of everything, but perhaps there's 1 or perhaps 2 things that you think are right for you on that day or right for you at that time. And that's a bit like these seminars. It's kind of a question of looking at this sort of general information and trying to tune into the bits which fit in with you or seem to make sense to you. So within each seminar, if there's perhaps just 1 idea or 1 method that you'd like to try, that's probably a useful way of approaching it. So moving on from the aims and talking about the booklet, let's think a little bit about CBT. So in some ways CBT is like a taxi, which may seem like a strange idea, but when you get into a taxi, the first thing we need to do is tell the taxi where we want to go. And by that, in CBT, what we mean is, what would you like to get out of the therapy? How would you like life to be different if you didn't have this problem that you were seeking help with, or the problem wasn't affecting your life so much? Now, very often when we ask that question, as we do at the beginning of therapy or during the assessment phase, people will answer really with a description of the problem. So they'll say something like, well, I just want to be happy, or I don't want to be unhappy anymore. I just want to stop thinking about all these awful thoughts I have. I want to feel less anxious. I want to feel less guilty. And this is really useful because what we're doing here is defining and describing the problem. So one thing that we do early in cognitive behaviour therapy is get a brief and simple but very pertinent description or definition of the problem. So here's an example, a real example from clinical practice. I check obsessively. I try hard not to show others vulnerability or weakness. I feel I'm not as connected with people or myself as I want to be. So this would be a problem definition that was developed in partnership with the CBT therapist, and will give a degree of focus throughout the therapy. So whenever you and your therapist maybe feel that you've lost your way a bit and you're not sure what to talk about in the session or what's important to focus on, you can always go back to the problem definition and decide together which bit is still important to work on. Another thing that you'll do with your problem definition is you'll rate it. You usually rate it in two ways. One might be in terms of how much the problem's upsetting you at present, perhaps on a scale of 0 to 8 or 0 to 10. And another way might be in terms of how often or to what extent it's interfering with your life. Now, by rating the problem definition, this gives us another way of measuring whether or not the therapy is working and in what way. So perhaps when you have your review round about session 8, you can re-rate the problem definition, and hopefully the scores that you scored at the beginning of treatment will have started to come down. But if they haven't, that's also useful because it gives us a chance to discuss, well, why not? What is it about the problem that still hasn't shifted? And perhaps we need to adapt our therapy around that feedback. So let's look at another real problem definition from cognitive behaviour therapy. When I have physical sensations in my tummy, for example when I'm accelerating in the car, or I'm stressed or I'm anxious or in a shop, I think I'm losing control. This leads to an adrenaline rush and a panic attack. I try to cope by distracting myself, using breathing techniques, or avoiding the situation altogether. So this is a problem definition for someone who's experiencing panic attacks. And notice within it that it's got several component parts or bits that we'll usually find in any good problem definition. It's got a description of some physical sensations. It's got some thoughts. In this case, I'm losing control. It's got some emotion, feeling stressed or anxious. And it's got some behaviours, trying to cope through distraction, breathing techniques or avoidance. And usually a good problem definition will have those component parts. And here's a third example. This one's more pertinent or to low mood or depression. I feel low and tired. I worry excessively about dying and my health. I busy myself with tasks to distract myself from uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. And I give myself a kicking for worrying about stuff I don't need to. I visit the doctor too much. So this problem definition was someone who was depressed but also had a diagnosis of health anxiety. This means that they used to worry more than they thought was reasonable about their health, and as a consequence they'd go and visit the doctor and do other things, what they saw as being too often too much. Another thing to notice about this problem definition is we're using the client's own words. So here you see the client uses the language, I give myself a kicking, or they're very self-critical, but we use the client's own language in the problem definition. So what we've done so far is we've looked at this idea that therapy is a bit like a taxi, and when we get into a taxi we need to say where we want to go, but often we describe where we are, what the problem is, and that's useful because it gives us a chance to define the problem together and kind of get a baseline about where we're starting treatment from. Coming back to the taxi analogy, the next thing is we need to work out where we want to go. So knowing the problem is somewhat useful, as we've just discussed, but if we get into a taxi, that would be a little bit like saying, well, I don't want to go to Headingley, or I don't want to go to the airport, I definitely still don't want to go to the train station anymore. It's very understandable, but of course the taxi driver won't know where to take you. So what we need to do in CBT is to focus on some specific goals or targets which give both you and your CBT therapist, or in this case your taxi driver, a clear idea about if the CBT has gone well, how life would be, how life would look different. So let's look at some real examples from CBT, and I think these targets or goals map onto the problem definitions we've just looked at. So by the end of treatment I will spend half an hour with Jim 3 times a week, at the end of the day chatting, reading, playing a game. So notice that in this first target it doesn't mention anything about the unwanted thoughts or the unwanted feelings or ideas, but they're the sorts of things that really matter to the person that the problem has been getting in the way of, and it's the sorts of things that matter that the person wants to see more of by the end of treatment. And these are the sorts of benchmarks that the client would measure whether or not the CBT has been effective or not. Let's look at the second one. So this one maps onto the person who had the problem definition describing panic attacks. So their goal, or one of their goals for treatment, would be to travel on the bus to work every day. And again, in the target it doesn't include reducing any symptoms or any of the negative thoughts the person has, but it's very much focused on one of the key changes in behaviour that they'd like to see by the end of treatment. Like all the targets listed here, again we'd rate them usually in terms of how successful the person is at the beginning of treatment, so that we can review how successful they are at review, perhaps in the middle of treatment, and once again at the end. So the third target, which is a real example from treatment, is this person would like to sit with colleagues in the staff room and join in chatting 2 times a week for 15 minutes or more. Now, a quality to notice about this target, as for all the targets, is it's SMART. Now by that I mean it's specific, it's measurable, it's probably achievable and realistic, and it's timed. And again, with your CBT therapist early in therapy, your therapist will encourage you not just to think about general goals, but really quite specific ones. So in this example, we've got where the person is going to sit down, which is in the staff room, the specific behaviour that they're going to be doing, which is joining in and chatting, how often they're going to be doing it, which is twice a week, and for how long they're going to be doing it, which is 15 minutes or more. Now this specificity, or the specific nature of the target, is really useful because it helps us again to measure whether or not we've achieved the target that we set out to achieve. So we've gone through 3 fairly typical examples of CBT targets. They're things that you'd set up at the beginning of your therapy. They help us to stay focused, They help us to work as a team with your therapist and to really stay focused not just on the problem, which is important, but also where you want to go, so we know through another measure whether or not the therapy is working. Now, very often when we ask our clients what matters to them or what they'd like to get out of therapy, this isn't as easy as it might look. Sometimes clients have lost track of what matters to them. They find it very difficult to work out what they value anymore. And this is very common when we've been very worried or very anxious or very depressed for a long period of time. And that's really what the rest of this seminar is focused on, is how easy it is for when we've been anxious or depressed for a long time to lose touch with what matters to us. And what we're going to do next in the seminar is look at 3 ways that can occur. Okay, so life is spelled hassle. And this is a quote from a man called Albert Ellis, who's one of the people, along with a man called Beck, kind of invented cognitive behaviour therapy. And what Albert Ellis was drawing our attention to here is that life happens, and often it's very stressful, and all sorts of stressful life events can occur. We might lose or gain a new job, we break up, or conversely we get stuck in a relationship we don't want to be in, and that goes for friendships as well as intimate relationships. Things like school holidays or holidays in general, things that on the face of it might seem like really positive things, can actually be really stressful. Looking after children, managing work-life balance. We may get assaulted or abused, or may indeed be in an abusive relationship. We get married, again on paper or in the films. Getting married is often a very positive thing, and it may remain a positive thing, but at the same time it may also be very hassly, be very, very stressful, and like any marriage, it will probably have its ups and downs. We may experience a loss. We may lose a good friend or a relative, a pet even. All these things are stressful and are likely to affect our mood. Starting a family, or finding out that we can't have a family. Moving away from home, perhaps you've come to Leeds to start a new job or to start university. The list is endless. Hassly things happen in our lives, and sometimes they come along in lots of drips, so we don't really notice the way our lives are changing and the hassly, stressful things are building up, or sometimes they come along unexpectedly or in very large doses. But either way, life happens, and when it does, we usually get into some kind of a pattern like this, which is a very normal reaction to life events. So as this diagram shows, life happens, and we're highlighting here the kind of negative life events or stressful life events, hassly life events, but also they've got a positive aspect too. But one way or t'other, they'll probably lead to either doing less or losing touch with what matters, or in some way life becomes less rewarding. So for example, when we move to university, or if we move away from our home to move to take a new job, this may in some ways be exciting and challenging. We may really be looking forward to it, but at the same time we're moving away, say, from our social networks that we had in the last place we lived. Maybe our key activities were there as well, say a mountain biking group that we used to go out with. We're going to lose touch with that. There's bound to be some kind of reduction in doing the things that we previously found rewarding. Similarly, if you chose something like having a baby, on one level that may be a very positive and exciting time, but also it's also a very challenging time around the birth, and in the period afterwards, it's a fundamental and ongoing change to how things were before. And we may be expecting life to be very rewarding, but what we may actually have not really realised is just quite how tiring it is, and how much time it takes, which inevitably mean that although we're doing more of something which perhaps is fantastic and rewarding, we're losing doing some of the things that we were doing before. So this is a very normal reaction to these sorts of life events that happen. Now, the next step in this very normal reaction is if we have life events and then we start doing less of what matters to us, or life just becomes less rewarding for those sorts of reasons we've just been talking about, then it's perfectly normal and natural for this to lead to low mood, low energy, low motivation, feeling anxious, having negative self-critical thoughts. And this is a very normal process which perhaps you can recognise. If we stop doing the things that matter to us, we're likely to have a kind of negative reaction in some ways, likely to make us feel like this, anxious or stressed, or all sorts of negative feelings. Now, if we think about it, it couldn't really be any other way, because if we spend time doing the things that are important to us or matters to us, we usually expect that when we've done them, we feel some kind of reward. That may be excitement or joy or satisfaction, not necessarily something that's fun or pleasurable or enjoyable, but something which afterwards we can step back and think, yeah, that was the right thing to do, that felt right, or that felt good. So you may recognise this pattern from your own life, and you may recognise that at times this has lasted over a period of a day or a week or a month or perhaps longer. You may also have noticed that when you've come out of this period, so this pattern of having a change in our life situation, of having an adjustment in how much we're engaging or doing what matters to us, and then beginning to feel anxious or stressed or self-critical. You may have noticed that that's lasted for a short period of time, but then you've managed to kind of get back on track, kind of snap out of it, or start to feel your old self again. And usually this coincides with re-engaging with doing the things that matter to us, or adapting so that you start doing different things that are important, or start doing things in a different way. However, sometimes rather than breaking out of this cycle or starting to feel better again, we get stuck and we start to feel very low or anxious over a sustained period of time, and we may indeed actually become clinically depressed. And this is very common, and this is very normal, and often it looks a little bit like this.
Right then, sir. What seems to be the problem?
Well, where do I start? Sometimes it's hard to put your finger on it, but I feel like I can't cope. Like I'm out of control.
Let me see if I can guess. You're not sleeping. You worry about absolutely everything. You feel like you're dragging yourself through the day. You get panic attacks out of the blue. You feel worthless. Get angry for no reason whatsoever. You can't switch off. You can't sit at peace, on edge, all day long. You feel as though your concentration's going right down the tubes. You think the worst is always going to happen. You feel as though your life is completely hopeless. You're irritable. You're probably tearful. And you're drinking as a way to cope with it.
That's it! That's exactly right. You know exactly how I'm feeling. Now please tell me, what is this?
I'm buggered if I know. I've been feeling like that for years.
So we can all get stuck at times in this depressed, low cycle where we experience some of those symptoms in the clip. So we're all vulnerable to getting stuck in these kind of cycles, even Glaswegian GPs. So let's look now then at 3 reasons how we can get stuck. or why we get stuck. The first one we're going to look at is avoidance. Now, for those of you who've watched some of the other seminars, or perhaps you've done any reading around low mood or depression, avoidance is one of the really big things that maintains or keeps us stuck in low mood, in worry and in anxiety. What sorts of things do you think people do to avoid having those experiences that we looked at in the previous slide? Those experiences of feeling anxious, those experiences of feeling low, of having self-critical thoughts. Just take a few minutes now. If you've got a pen and paper, that's great. In a minute, just to pause the video and write down as many ideas as you can about either the way that you do or the things people do in general to avoid having unwanted thoughts, feelings and sensations. So the sorts of things that may have been on your list may be very similar to the sorts of ideas that people come up with when we do this seminar as a whole group. Sorts of things that people tend to say are avoiding difficult thoughts and feelings by drinking alcohol, which is the one that came up in the clip. We might avoid unwanted thoughts and feelings by avoiding the situation that triggers them. So we may avoid going out to see our friends, we might avoid going for the run, we might avoid going to the gym, we might avoid a problem or solving a problem. So we may avoid opening that envelope that's fallen onto the mat by the front door. We might avoid having that conversation with a friend or a colleague which we're worried about having in case of the consequences. So we avoid things in lots of different ways. Now let's look at this diagram to understand why we keep doing this and how it can be a problem. So one of the reasons we get stuck is we try as humans to avoid unwanted thoughts, feelings, sensations and the situations that cause these sensations and thoughts and feelings. So this diagram shows how this can become a cycle. We have the thoughts and feelings and this leads to avoidance, and in this diagram we're talking about experiential avoidance. We might dwell on things, we might avoid the situation, we might just withdraw from the situation, either literally or we'll be in the situation but we're actually very much inside our heads, or we're not really in touch with what's going on. Now all these things lead to short-term relief. In other words, they work. They enable us to, in the short term, start to feel better. Now, avoiding things in this way and indeed experiencing relief from physical symptoms, so for example through distraction, isn't necessarily a bad thing and might actually be quite a useful thing. The difficulty comes though is when we start using this avoidance or experiential avoidance too much, where the goals of our behaviour is very much about seeking relief and not enough about seeking the reward of doing the things that matters to us. So gradually, or sometimes quite rapidly over a period of time, too much of our energy gets spent on trying to avoid feeling bad, and not enough of our energy is focused on doing the things that matter to us in order to feel good. Let's look at two examples of how that might work. Say if our thoughts and feelings are making us feel tired and we're having thoughts like I can't be bothered to go to the gym or I can't be bothered to go for a run, then we might avoid having those feelings by making the decision not to go. Say, oh, I'll go tomorrow, or I'll do that some other time. And we get a sense of relief. But what that's meant is that we've missed out on doing something that matters to us. We've missed out, say, on going for the run or going to the gym, which in turn can then lead to some other unwanted thoughts and feelings, like, for example, continuing to feel tired, perhaps not sleeping so well that night. Another way this might work is if we're having, say, some unwanted worrying thoughts about something, we may avoid these in a more subtle way. So we might spend a lot of effort trying to push these thoughts out of our head by trying not to think about it. So we might engage in something that's really important to us, like for example going out for a meal with our partner or listening to our child read at night. But while we're there, we're so busy trying to distract ourselves from the worrying thoughts or feelings that the situation isn't as rewarding as it would be if we weren't doing that. So we're avoiding it in a more subtle way, and it has the effect of making something which could be very satisfying less rewarding. Now, another way that avoiding unwanted thoughts and feelings, though perfectly understandable and not necessarily problematic if we don't do it too much, is self-criticism. As this diagram shows, if we try to avoid unwanted thoughts and feelings by avoiding or withdrawing or dwelling on things too much, then we can become quite self-critical. We start to notice that we're doing this, and then we start to give ourselves a hard time. Going back to the example of not going for a run or not going to the gym, we perhaps know in our hearts that actually we could have gone or we should have gone, and then we can start criticising ourselves for, say, being weak or not trying hard enough, which in turn is another unwanted thought that we don't want, and we can start feeling guilty or ashamed. Another way, as this diagram shows, that if we're spending a lot of energy trying to avoid unwanted thoughts and feelings, it can unknowingly shift attention onto the problem itself. So we can start thinking about or paying attention to either the problem which is leading to the unwanted thoughts and feelings, or it can lead us to paying more attention to the thoughts and feelings themselves, which in turn might make us vulnerable to avoiding more, and so the cycle continues. So avoidance is a very understandable way that people can get stuck in periods of low mood, and is one of the ways that we really understand what depression is, what low mood is, what anxiety is, and what keeps it going. Now, if this goes on for a while, what we end up with is the second way that we can understand what keeps people stuck, and that is habit. So we've looked so far at how when we avoid things, it leads to a sense of relief. Now, if you just pause for a moment, if you've got a pencil and paper, that's great, but just pause the video for a moment and just ask yourself this question: what is a habit? Okay, so I don't know what ideas you've come up with, but usually when we talk about this, when we're doing the seminar in a whole group, we usually come up with a definition which is something like this one, which comes from Wikipedia, which is an action performed repeatedly and automatically, usually without awareness. So thinking back to what we've been looking at in terms of avoidance, if we start to avoid too much, we start to get hits of relief, and before we know it, we've started to get into this repeated automatic cycle where we're no longer really noticing that we're avoiding things at all. It's just become something that we're used to and is going on without us really thinking about it too much. So let's think a little bit more about helpful habits and unhelpful habits. And again, if you just pause for a moment, have a think about your life or have a think about people's lives in general, and write down under two headings, helpful habits and unhelpful habits, what would you say would be the difference between, or the qualities of, helpful habits and unhelpful habits? And just stop the video for a minute and make some notes about what you think is the difference between the two things. Okay, so this is the way that we've chosen to think about it for this seminar in terms of doing what matters. So helpful habits generally tend to be those habits, these automatic bundles of behaviours which take us toward what matters. They end up with us doing more of the things that are important to us. Where unhelpful habits, perhaps characterised by ones where they're primarily aimed to seek relief or from unwanted thoughts, feelings or physical sensations, while they might lead to relief, they have the unintended consequence of taking us further away from what matters to us. So coming back to the diagram that we looked at last time, it's very understandable that we do this because it generates relief. And this is a really important idea for us to get our head around in terms of our recovery from anxiety and low mood. Is us humans are very vulnerable to getting in these relief-seeking habits which unknowingly can end up taking us away from what's important and taking us towards cycles where too much of our energy is spent on trying to seek relief from unwanted thoughts and feelings. It's really important for us to understand this because it helps us to be more compassionate toward ourselves and to not put too much energy into being self-critical. Humans are very vulnerable to getting into habits. It's very normal, it's very understandable, and it's something that we can do something about. However, if these habits go on unchecked, then they can maintain low mood, they can maintain anxiety, and it's the second way in which we've looked at in this seminar that keeps people stuck. If we stay in a habit like this for too long, this leads us to the third way of understanding what keeps people stuck in depression and to some extent anxiety, which is this: we start to lose touch even further with what matters to us. So not only are we perhaps spending less time doing what matters to us or what we value or what's important, we also start to find it increasingly more difficult to really appreciate what is important to us. In my work as a cognitive behaviour therapist, something I've been doing for about 10 years now, very commonly when I encourage clients to think about what they'd like to get out of treatment, to what would they like to see more of in their lives or what's important to them, sometimes this is really difficult. Sometimes people struggle to answer the question, what's important to them. They find it difficult to say, I'm not sure what my life stands for. So let's look a little bit next at what we mean by what matters or what we mean by values. So let's have a think then about what matters to us and what are values. Well, values are talking about the things about what we'd like our life to stand for. So even in the face of some of those unwanted thoughts and feelings or the real life problems that very often come our way, values are about defining what really matters to us. What qualities do we have or we want to have, even if life's not going the way we want it to go at the moment, and even if we're feeling really anxious or low or guilty. So values are about what we stand for. And they're about how do we want to act or behave, say as a friend or a brother or a worker, how we want to act or behave in any kind of role. Again, regardless perhaps of how we're actually feeling at the time, having a focus on what's important to us regardless of thoughts and feelings. Doing what matters or being in touch with our values is to do with how we want to act or behave regarding our health, regarding creativity, regarding our interests, regarding our work, excuse me, regarding any area of our lives. Now, we can think about values or what matters to us rather like life's compass. So in the seminar so far, we've talked about how normal it is for humans, especially when we have difficult or stressful life events around, to have an increase in unwanted thoughts or feelings such as anxiety. And one idea is to think about, well, although it's understandable to be feeling very low or to be feeling anxious, how useful is it to use anxiety or to use low mood as a compass to navigate our lives? How useful is it to use anxiety as a way of guiding how we should behave? If we do, we're likely to spend perhaps an increasing amount of time putting a lot of effort into trying to relieve ourselves from unwanted thoughts and feelings. An alternative then is to use a value as a life's compass. So thinking about what matters to us, what's important to us about any particular situation, then as a way of deciding what to do and how to act in a situation. If you take that idea a bit further, when we're in a storm of thoughts and feelings, perhaps we're feeling very anxious or we're feeling very low or very tired, if we can be in touch with what matters to us, if we can be in touch with what is it about this situation that's important to us, even if we're in a storm of thoughts and feelings, values can be like that lighthouse in this diagram, helping us to navigate and work out what to do next, rather than being too pushed around by unwanted thoughts and feelings. So, let's just recap this section that we've done so far, which is all about trying to understand what keeps people stuck in patterns of low mood and anxiety. What we've talked about is how life happens. Life can be very hassly, life can be stressful, and even positive events like getting a new job, going on holiday, getting married, having children, school holidays. Life happens, and when it does, this tends to affect what matters to us. We either end up doing less of what matters to us, or the things that matter to us don't seem as rewarding as they used to be. And very normally and very naturally as humans, we'll start to experience unwanted thoughts and feelings. Now, when this happens, we tend to avoid. We tend to avoid because we get a sense of relief. And if we do that too much, we start to get out of the habit of doing what matters to us, and we get into habits which are more orientated about seeking relief. And if that goes on for a long period of time, we tend to lose sight of our values. We tend to lose sight of what matters to us, and this can make it even more difficult to get back on track with our lives and break out of those cycles that we've looked at earlier in the seminar. Okay, so let's look at that summary then in the terms of a diagram. This diagram is an example of a formulation, and for those of you who've watched the other seminars in this series, you'd have come across this idea before. So this is a general formulation with general information. But when you come to do your CBT, it'll be again specific to you with your life events, your unwanted thoughts and feelings, etc. In the formulation rather than general ones. So here's how the idea is summarised. In that first line going across the top, we have life events which tend to lead to doing less of what matters or life becoming less rewarding, and this leads to unwanted thoughts and feelings. This is natural and normal, and very often we spontaneously break out of this cycle on our own. However, because we're getting unwanted thoughts and feelings, this tends to lead to avoidance, dwelling and withdrawal, and that in itself can then lead to a reduction further in rewarding life experiences or doing less of what matters. And then if we put the other layer on top of that diagram, you see here how understandable the avoidance is because we're getting relief, but at the same time there's the unintended consequence of how when we start to notice that we're avoiding, we can become self-critical, which then becomes another unwanted thought, and also how the more avoidance and more relief seeking we do, we start to notice the problem or think about the problem or the problematic thoughts even more. So that can deepen our depression or deepen our low mood. So these patterns and cycles are the ones which we target in treatment to try to firstly to understand, as we have done in this first half of the seminar, and then to break out of. And that's what we're going to move on to next, is 2 clusters of techniques. The first one aimed at trying to become more in touch with what's important to us, what matters to us. And then a second main technique, which is called trap and track, which is aimed at helping us to become more aware of our avoidance patterns, our avoidance cycles, and to be clearer to ourselves about what the purpose of those behaviours are. In other words, to become clearer about what our avoidance habits are. And that's what we call a trap. And the second half of that technique is to come up with a track, where we can notice our traps, but then try to get back on track with our lives. And that will become clearer as we go through that technique. But coming back to the first thing, the first technique we're going to look at is in line with trying to get back in touch with what's important to us, trying to get back in touch or stay in touch with our values. And we call this knowing what matters, or becoming more aware of what matters to us. And what I'd like to do together now is a brief technique or experiment. Doesn't work for everybody, but just see it as something that you can try. And what I'd like you to do is, with your eyes open or with your eyes closed, is just try to think about or remember a sweet spot. Something from the day so far, or from the week so far, or the month so far, that you see as being a sweet memory. You see as being a sweet spot or a sweet memory, something that felt good, something that really mattered to you. And perhaps just close your eyes and just try to bring that memory into your mind. Perhaps think about what was going on at the time, who you were with, what you were doing, what the weather was like, how it felt. And just try to hang out with that memory, stay with it, and really notice how it feels to be in touch with that memory of something that's sweet, something that matters to you. And just for a few more moments, just stay with that memory. Okay, now in your own time, just kind of come out of that memory and come back to the present moment. Now, as I said before, not everybody can do that, and that's again completely normal. So if that hasn't worked for you, it doesn't matter, then you can try out other methods and change methods that we're going to use in this seminar. But for those of you who did manage to bring up a sweet spot or a sweet memory, let's think then together about how that mattered, or what mattered about that, or to put in another way, what are your values with regard to that memory. So what is it about that memory that really mattered to you? If you've got a pen and paper, just jot down any ideas. There's no wrong or right about this, but just try to put something down about what is it about that memory that really matters to you, that's important. What values can you recognise in this memory? And again, maybe jot a few ideas down. And by values, meaning all sorts of words, but things like, well, it matters to me because it was an example of being kind, or it matters to me because I was spending time with my friends, and friendship is a value that I really think is important. So just spend a few minutes just reflecting on this and writing down any ideas that you have. So we call this the sweet spot exercise, and it's an experiential way of pausing through your day at any time and just getting in touch with a helpful or positive memory, and then reflecting on that and thinking, why does this matter? What are my values? with regard to this memory. And if you can get more in touch with that, it makes it a little bit more likely that when unwanted thoughts and feelings show up, you can use this way of thinking, this sense of what matters to you, to navigate your way through that situation rather than being so pushed around by unwanted thoughts and feelings. Let's look at another way that you can both work out what matters to you, but also then connect with it a bit more. So in this diagram, there's this guy with this plug, and he's just about to plug it in. He's just about to try to get more connected with what matters, and that's what this next technique, this next method's all about. And as you can see, it's an electrical plug, and that's very much how values are thought to work. So being in touch with what's important to us, a bit like you did in the sweet spot exercise, it tends to give us more energy, it tends to make us feel vital, it tends us to feel that sense of meaning and purpose, which is almost the opposite of being depressed or feeling low. When we're feeling depressed and low and we're tending to avoid unwanted thoughts and feelings, we can feel very disconnected from our lives. It can feel that life lacks meaning, lacks vitality, lacks this kind of connected and sense of power. So what we're trying to do in the therapy is trying to work out what matters to us, but also to deliberately try to connect more with it. So if we take that idea a step further, here's an exercise which is in your pack, which we'll go through together now, but you can do right now in the seminar, but also you can spend a little bit more time too afterwards, working out again what values are important to you, but also trying to work out how much power, how much satisfaction, vitality and reward you're getting from that at the moment, at this stage in your life, at this moment in time. So over on the left hand side, excuse me, you've got that chap up there with the plug, and then in the middle you've got this idea of sparking in terms of connection. In the top box we write down a life or a values area and how important it is to us at the moment, and we kind of rate that in terms of 0 to 10. So you might want to put there, for example, a value like kindness or excitement or courage, or what usually people find it easier to put an area of life that's important to you. So you might want to put in that box something like my relationships, friendships, work, learning, health, anything, a part of your life where values tend to show up. And then you rate how important that is, 0 to 10. And then following it through down the cable to the bottom box, the next bit then is you hold that value or you hold that area of your life in mind, and you rate it not in terms of how much it's important to you, but currently at this time in your life, how much reward, vitality or satisfaction are you getting from either that value or that part of your life. I'll take you through an example so it makes a bit more sense when you start doing this yourself. So this is a real example, and this is an example from my life about 3 years ago. So when I did this exercise, I chose the area of values activity for me, which is my work, and on a scale of 0 to 10 I rated this pretty highly, and I rated this as an 8. So work for me 2 or 3 years ago in terms of importance was 8. I then went on to reflect on, well, at the moment, how much satisfaction, vitality or reward am I getting from this? And when I reflected on this, I came to the conclusion that it was about a 4. So not bad, but it wasn't as satisfying and rewarding, say, as it had been a year or 2 ago. And when I reflected on this, one of the reasons for this was that although I really enjoyed my job, especially my face-to-face work with my clients, I was feeling a little bit bored or a little bit tired of just doing that, and I felt I needed a bit more challenge or reward. So when I noticed this difference between how important work is and how much reward I was getting from it, it made me think, well, what can I do to act even more in my valued direction? What can I do to make work more satisfying? And I made a few changes that then brought that up to more like an 8. And one of those changes was writing the materials for this seminar. So that's one of the ways this can work. You look at an area of your life that you think is important. You then follow it through and notice how much reward or vitality you're getting from that area. Now, if the two numbers are very similar or very high, it probably means that that part of your life is going pretty well and you're getting pretty much what you want from it. But if you notice, for example, like I did, that the reward or satisfaction level is much lower than the important level, that might mean that it's an area that needs some change or something, to start doing something differently in order to get that reward or rating up, even if it's just by 1 or 2. So here's your chance to have a quick go at doing this now. This is in your pack, but you don't need the pack to do this. Just have a brief think for 5 minutes about your own life. Choose any area of your life. It doesn't need to be the big one or the important one, but it might be. Just select an area of your life or a value and write that next to the man with the plug in his hand. Then rate how important it is to you, 0 to 10. And then go into the box down at the bottom. Write down how much vitality or reward you're currently getting from that part of life. And you might find this quite an emotional thing. You might find yourself feeling quite upset, and again, that's normal and understandable, that as we get more in touch with our values, more in touch with what's important to us, we usually also start to feel more emotional and more alive. And that's kind of what it's meant by the idea of being plugged in. Being in touch with and acting in accordance with your values doesn't necessarily mean that you don't feel anxious or uncomfortable or sad, and sometimes it can actually be more upsetting or being more anxious for a period, because this is part of life. So if you need more time to finish that exercise, just pause the seminar now and I'll give you as much time as you like to just finish that exercise off. Okay, so we've covered so far these 2 techniques for getting more in touch with your values or what matters to you. We've done the sweet spot exercise, which is a experiential type exercise, and now we've done this written exercise, which starts to give you a bit of a map about what parts of your life are important to you and how much reward and vitality you're currently getting from them. Now, we've just concentrated so far on one part of your life, but this diagram, which again you'll find in your pack, gives you a really good exercise to do to check in with your whole life at the moment, and using this idea of how plugged in you are, to do a review of your whole life, checking in with how important different areas of your life are right now in your life. There's no right or wrong to this. And then in the middle area, writing down how much reward or satisfaction. Now, this is an American document, and some of the areas that they consider to be typical of the sorts of things or areas of life people find important have just been summarised. But if you want to add one in or just change the heading of any of these areas, please do so. This is in your pack. Have a go at it and see how useful it is in terms of getting more in touch with what matters to you. Okay, so when you come to doing your trap and track work, you can either use a piece of paper like this, or you can use one of the templates which is in the back of the booklet we talked about earlier. So just introducing you to what a trap is. The T, as we said, stands for trigger. Now by this, what we mean is the thing that has set off or activated your low mood, your negative thoughts, your anxiety, the unwanted images, all that stuff that we talked about earlier in the seminar that human beings tend to get from time to time as part of normal life. So a trigger might be a thing, it might be a place, it might be a situation, so it might be something outside of our bodies, or it might be something like a thought in itself, or thinking about going somewhere. So it could be almost anything at all which triggers the problem. So for example, it might be a letter dropping through a letterbox, it might be an invitation to go around someone's house, it might be going to the supermarket or thinking about going to the supermarket, or it might be someone giving you a compliment. It can be absolutely anything at all. And very often the way that we work out what the trigger is when we start to feel uncomfortable, we can stop and we can ask ourselves, what was it that I was just doing just before I started to feel uncomfortable? Or what was it that I was thinking just before I started to feel uncomfortable? So let's just imagine for this example that the trigger is thinking about going to the supermarket. If you imagine it's a very common one, if you're socially anxious, or if you're depressed, or if you've been starting to have panic attacks recently, going to a supermarket might be a very anxiety provoking trigger. So let's say the trigger in this situation is going to thinking about shopping. So here we have an example of a trigger. Now the next bit is the response. Now by response, rather than a behaviour type response, what we're interested in here is once again is those thoughts, feelings, images, sensations, all the stuff that goes on inside our skin, which is in response to the trigger. So if we think about this example about someone perhaps who's having panic attacks or is worried about what people think of them, when they start to approach going to the supermarket or thinking about going to the supermarket, the response they might have, and it could be anything, is perhaps a thought which might be, I'm going to panic. They might have some emotion which might be, say, anxiety. If they're feeling anxious, the chances are they're going to get some unwanted physical sensations, such as I felt hot, heart beat increased, and that might be for this person the main responses they have when they think about or start going to the supermarket. So this person has started to feel panicky, anxious, they're feeling hot, their heart's beating faster, and they noticed that this was triggered by going to the shopping centre or going to the supermarket. So far in our trap we've worked out what the trigger is or was, what our response has been, and next what we're going to look at is the avoidance pattern. We looked at earlier in the seminar about how understandable it is for us humans when we start to feel this sort of stuff to avoid having those thoughts, feelings and sensations by avoiding them. Now in this situation, avoidance might show up in, say, two clusters. One might be we might literally start to go, or we might turn around and come back. So we've literally avoided going to the supermarket. But there might be also some more subtle avoidances we do as a way of coping. Sometimes these are called safety-seeking behaviours. So perhaps this person actually managed to go to the supermarket, but the only way that they could cope with or avoid these unwanted thoughts and feelings was to rush, to avoid eye contact with people, perhaps to keep their head down. And those two would be more subtle avoidance patterns. If the person was perhaps having an unwanted image, say for example they keep thinking that, or having an image that others are looking at me, then this would be part of their response, and it would make it likely that maybe the avoidance pattern they're using might be to walk around looking down. So this person managed to go to the supermarket, but they walked around looking down, they rushed, and maybe that's the main avoidance pattern this person's identified. So here we have the main part of working out a trap. The person stepped back, they've noticed their response, they've worked out what their trigger is, and then they're focused on what their avoidance pattern is too. They try to avoid these uncomfortable feelings and thoughts by walking around looking down and by rushing. Just to finish off then doing a trap, there's two other things that we want to focus on. The first part sometimes is very obvious, but sometimes isn't so clear. We always want to know what the circumstances are. This technique, and in fact all the techniques from this seminar, come from a type of CBT called behavioural activation, where most of the work is focused on how we behave and patterns of behaviour. And a phrase that comes from behavioural activation is this phrase that context is everything, and that we can only really understand how we're behaving if we look at the circumstances in which the behaviour is happening in. So for this person, it was also relevant circumstances that on that day they were going to the supermarket. They'd also had a really difficult phone call in the morning. They were worrying about a situation at work. So let's put that in as well. So worried about work, and they were already anxious. The other bit we need to look at is the consequences. So perhaps they didn't start doing their trap, working out their trap on a piece of paper until they got back that day. And then they asked themselves, well, what were the consequences of using this avoidance pattern? By walking around and looking down and by rushing, what were the consequences? And we tend to do that in terms of short term, long term, and also in terms of what effect it had on our feelings. So for this person, they worked out that the consequences of their trap was that in the short term, they felt what we've been talking about right the way through this seminar is they had some relief. They managed to get their shopping done. They managed to not have a panic attack on this occasion, and they felt that this helped to get them through and out the other side of this situation. However, the longer term consequence was that shopping wasn't fun anymore. They really weren't enjoying it, and in fact they felt stressed the whole time they were there. So they wrote down for their long-term consequences is that it was no longer fun, no longer enjoyable. And I'll write that in shorthand because I don't have very much space here. But as long as you understand your trap, that's what's important. Another long-term consequence was what they were noticing, that it's almost like the more they used their avoidance patterns, the more they rushed, the more they looked down, and the more they avoided talking to people, it almost seemed that in the long term they were getting more and more anxious about going out. So we'll put that down, and again in shorthand, they were getting more anxious, and they were getting more worried about talking to people. So here we have a complete trap analysis. We've got our circumstances, that it was made worse because they were worried about work and they were already anxious. What seemed to trigger was beginning to think about and then going to the shop. Their response was thoughts, I'm going to panic, feelings, anxiety, response, physical symptoms of feeling hot, their heartbeat, and also having an image in their mind that others were actually looking at them and looking at them critically. So with all that going on, it's understandable that they started to avoid those thoughts and feelings by walking around, looking down, by rushing and actually avoiding talking to people, in spite of the fact that their values lay in being quite a sociable person and quite a chatty person. And then stepping back again, they reflected that the consequences of this were, in the short term, they felt relief. But in the longer term, it seemed to be keeping the problem going, because shopping was no longer fun. They were getting increasingly anxious about going to the shop when they came back, and they were worrying about it more and more. Okay, so now we've got our head around understanding what a trap is and how to do our own, what we call functional analysis, working out what triggers unwanted thoughts and feelings and what our avoidance pattern is. Let's look at some examples from clinical practice, real examples of how clients who've been using this form, this technique in their CBT. Let's look at some clinical examples. So this person worked out that the circumstance for their trap was that they were at work, it was before lunch and it was Monday. And their trigger was that they asked the co-worker out for lunch, and she said she had other plans. Now their response was that they felt embarrassed and depressed. Now, to cope with those unwanted thoughts and feelings, what they did was, on reflection, was they noticed an avoidance pattern. They ate lunch alone at their desk, and they spent time thinking about why she wouldn't want to have lunch with me. Sometimes this is called dwelling, sometimes it's called rumination. You might have another word for it, but it's a very common things that we do, that us humans do, if we're feeling bad. Almost as a way of coping, we avoid unwanted feelings by kind of going over and over things, almost as if we think about it enough, we might start to feel better. But very often it doesn't work like that. How it did work for this person was when they looked at their consequences, they thought that the consequences of acting in this way, although understandable, was that they felt depressed and anxious most of the day, and avoided that person for the rest of the day as well. So this is an example from clinical practice of a trap. Let's look at another one. Now this person had a diagnosis of excessive worry and obsessive and compulsive disorder. And the circumstance in which their trap occurred was, it was at their home, it was bedtime, and they were feeling tired. The trigger was going to bed and walking past the kitchen door. That's the thing that seemed to set it all off. And what was set off was this response. They started to have worrying thoughts like, is the cooker on? What if I start to feel anxious and responsible? Feeling like that, they started to avoid things, and the way they avoided was, rather than literally avoiding, they started to avoid having those thoughts and feelings by checking the cooker, not just once, but for several minutes, till it started to feel right. So they checked the kettle, they checked the cooker, so it started to not just check the cooker, but it started to expand to other things. Now the consequences of this, when they reflected on this, was that indeed they did get some short-term relief. They did start to feel less worried and less anxious. But the long-term effect was that Paul, the person's husband, was annoyed as he was woken up when she came to bed, and he'd wanted a cuddle. And the same thing happened again the next day. So although it did work in the sense of a relief-seeking goal, it was interfering with what really mattered to this person, and as a consequence was feeding into her long-term anxiety and long-term depression. And let's look at the third trap. Circumstances getting out of the house in the morning. The trigger was this person's son is messing around with his brother, and that's what seemed to really set off the response, which were thoughts like, we're going to be late, why don't they listen, they should do as they're told, and feelings such as anger and disappointment that they're not behaving in the way that the person hoped they'd behave. And their avoidance pattern to try to get rid of these unwanted thoughts or feelings, or to fix them if you like, was to shout, to threaten, to speed up, to rush and to blame others, in this case the person's wife. Now the consequences of this was that the person felt guilty, it was a poor start to their day, and on reflection they were thinking that the kids weren't learning how to behave, and also that their wife was annoyed with them. It sounds like a really poor start to the day. So what we're going to look at next is the next stage of trap and track, which is working out what the alternative coping is. Let's look at that together for the example we did at the beginning. Okay, so let's look at working out a track or some alternative coping. So going back to the trap that we did a few minutes ago, if you remember, the circumstances were about firstly being anxious or worried because something had happened at work. The trigger was about thinking about or going shopping, and the response was, I'm going to panic, I'm going to get anxious, feeling hot, heartbeat, and having an image that others are looking at me. So when we come to working out alternative coping, the first thing to notice is that the trigger and the response remain the same. So the first time we try alternative coping, we can expect that the thing that triggers the unwanted response is likely to be very similar. The next time this person goes to do the shopping, even if they're trying an alternative coping, it's likely to set off exactly the same response. They're likely to feel panicky and anxious and have a racing heart, and it's quite possible they'll still have the image of others looking at them. However, what we need to do now is work out what might be an alternative coping. That is a different way of responding to these thoughts and feelings, and one which is more in line with what matters to them and less in line with being pushed around by unwanted thoughts and feelings. Now, there's no wrong or right to doing a track or working out what track should be, and the whole idea with this is, rather than expecting any particular outcome, what we try to do is get a state of mind which is experimental or pragmatic. By that I mean we try to approach this thinking about well, I don't know whether this is going to work or not, but let's try it 3 times and let's see what happens. Let's see which way works better. Now, looking at this, can you think of any alternative ways the person might cope with or might manage to go shopping and which don't involve avoidance? Just stop for a moment and come up with any suggestions you've got that this person might use for alternative coping next time they go to do their shopping. Okay, so let's imagine then that this person has brought this problem and put it on the agenda for their therapy session, and in session they worked out that trap that we've just looked at. They may have talked about this for a while in session. They may already have done some work around understanding panic or understanding anxiety, rather like we have done in the other seminars in this series. And just for example, the alternative coping they came up with was they were going to slow down. They were going to try to look around them. And they were going to remind themselves that thoughts are thoughts, not facts. Now, this is just one example of an alternative coping. There could be almost an infinite amount of ways the person might approach going to the supermarket, but this is just one example. Let's just say that she did go and she tried this alternative coping. She slowed down, she looked around, and while she was out, she was telling herself that even though she was getting these thoughts that she was going to panic and that others were looking at her, she reminded herself that thoughts were thoughts and not facts. When she'd done that 2 or 3 times, she then went back to her alternative coping plan, her track, and once again thought about what the consequences were. And what this person reflected on was that gradually anxiety reduced. People weren't looking at her. And she bumped into 2 people she knew, which for her was good because one of her values was about being sociable and being friendly toward other people. So this is an example about how we go from a trap to a track, and it's included the idea of testing, trying it out rather than getting too hooked up on any fixed idea about whether or not it's going to work or how it's going to work, but after you've done it, coming back again to the consequences to see what effect this way of responding to responses, this way of coping with these thoughts and feelings, not necessarily expecting them to get better or worse, but asking yourself which way works better for me. Is it the trap or is it the track? Let's look at some real clinical examples again together. So just before we look at the clinical examples, let's just summarise then some of the qualities of a track again. So getting back on track often involves working out the trigger, which is going to be the same as the trap, working out the response, which again is going to be the same as in the trap, and then coming up with some alternative coping, which is usually something active rather than avoidant, and is usually something that takes us toward what matters to us rather than away from what matters. So going back to the examples from clinical practice then, if you remember, our first trap involved triggers of someone asking someone out for lunch, and them saying no. And the response was they felt embarrassed and depressed. Just take a moment now just to have a brainstorm or come up with some ideas. What alternative coping ideas have you got for this person? How else might this person act in this situation, which is a move, rather than being driven by avoidance, is more of a toward move, something which takes them toward what matters to them. There's no wrong or right to that question. Let's have a look and see what this person did. Her alternative coping, which she tested out, was she reminded herself that thoughts were thoughts, not facts. She asked if she was free on another day. They ate lunch with others in the staff room. Or, alternatively, she would go out for a walk or look in some shops. So this was her planned coping, which she was then able to test out, follow through, and although they're not written here, she was able to work out what the consequences of this alternative coping were. And in the second example we looked at, if you remember, the situation or the circumstances that they were at home and it was bedtime, and the trigger was to do with walking past the kitchen. The unwanted response was in the line of worry or doubts. What if the cooker's on? What if I feel anxious? What if I feel responsible? What might this person do to cope differently? What might their alternative coping be? And remember, there's no wrong or right to this, it's just an idea that might be more of a toward move, taking us toward what matters, and less of an away move, taking us away from trying to avoid having unwanted thoughts and feelings. Okay, so let's look what they wrote. Their track was about, again, telling themselves that feelings are unpleasant but not dangerous. That being in bed with Paul and reading books mattered to them, that it was important, it was part of their value system. Try to accept the thoughts and feelings but still walk upstairs, past the trigger, and go to bed and cuddle Paul. And accept that, in the short term at least, that they may or may not sleep as well at first. They might remain being anxious, and that was something to be expected. After all, it takes a while to get used to situations, especially if we've been avoiding them for a long period of time. So finally, let's look at the third track, which is actually one of mine. This is a real situation from my life. And my circumstance was, when I tried to get out of the house in the morning with my kids, my son is often messing around with his brother. And my response is to have negative thoughts. We're going to be late, why don't they listen? They should do as they're told, and feeling really angry and disappointed. What alternative coping might I have come up with to still have these unwanted thoughts but try to cope with the situation in a different way? A one which maybe took me toward what mattered to me, in this case being a parent, and was less about just trying to get rid of or discharge the angry, disappointed feelings. Okay, well, what I actually did come up with was sort of a practical plan. I agreed with my wife that only one of us should get the kids ready in the morning so we're not both around at the same time. Change the situation. I decided to spend 30 minutes doing some of the exercises that we've looked at in the seminar today, trying to work out, well, what is important to me? What are my values as a dad? And I tried to focus on having the thoughts and feelings, but not speeding up. When my fight and flight system gets activated, something that we talk about in the other seminars, rather than speeding up and shouting and threatening, something the adrenaline and cortisol is kind of pushing me to do because I'm getting wound up, is try to kind of override that and really stay slowed down. And try generally to notice what's happening in the moment. And I can feed back that the consequences of this, although it wasn't easy and it took a lot of practice, it worked better. And I'm able to get out of the house in a less stressed or anxious state than I was before I started using the alternative coping. So, just like we did for summarising the main qualities of working out a trap, alternative coping may involve the following, but it's very flexible. It may involve changing how you behave in the same situation with the same triggers. It may be helped by asking yourself, is my tendency to avoid or seek relief in this situation interfering with more important goals or values? And if so, maybe what are they? Remind yourself and focus on what matters to you. So earlier on in this seminar we did the sweet spot exercise, and we did that exercise with the plug. If you've done those exercises, try to bring them to mind. Why is it worth trying to change this behaviour? Why is it worth trying to be willing to accept the unwanted thoughts and feelings, but act in a different way? You may need to develop a skill. Now, I'll give you an example to make sense of that. So I tend to get very anxious, or quite anxious or worried, if I need to do something on the computer at home which I'm not used to doing. So recently, for example, I had to help my child work on a spreadsheet. Now, spreadsheets isn't something that I've ever really learned to do. So in order to stop avoiding doing that, I had to face the fact that I needed to work out basically how to work a spreadsheet. So what I did was I went onto YouTube and I looked at some videos, and just on a basic level I know how to use a spreadsheet now. Alternative coping may involve using a technique to manage your mind or feelings differently. So in the examples that we've looked at so far, not only has the person changed their behaviour, they've also used some of the techniques that we cover in this course in order to do that. So we've talked about telling yourself that anxiety is normal, reminding yourself that feelings are uncomfortable but may actually be useful or certainly not harmful, or perhaps telling yourself that it's a thought and I don't really need to take it too seriously. Anything really which is in the service of taking you toward what matters rather than moving away from unwanted thoughts and feelings. And finally, an idea that we've touched on when we've talked about practice, a final idea about coping is about giving it a fair trial. This technique is less about having a clear idea or trying to predict what is going to happen. It's more about trying out alternative coping to see whether it works better, to see whether it's behaving in an alternative way is just better for you in your life. And there's this general idea of you need to do it at least 2 or 3 times, sometimes called the rule of 3, to give it a fair trial. So the 2 main techniques that we've looked at in this seminar are about getting more in touch with your values, and the second one, trap and track, is about trying to work out what your avoidance patterns are, recognising that they're really understandable, but trying to, in spite of your thoughts and feelings, try to work out an alternative coping which takes you toward what matters. Here's some ideas or images which may make a bit more sense of that. So if you look at this image here, it's a bit like this. When you're in a trap, it's a bit like being walked by your mind, or your mind taking you for a walk. So in this image we've got this idea that your mind or your brain is actually like a bit of a dog, and it's pulling at the lead, and if you look in the thought bubble, it's coming up with all sorts of typical negative thoughts that our minds tend to give us. And when we're in a trap, it's like our brain, or our dog in this case, is just sort of pulling us around. But when we're in a track, it's more like taking your mind for a walk. So your mind is still likely to come up with the same thoughts and feelings, at least in the first instance, but rather than letting your mind push you around or pull you around, you take your mind for a walk. And if we take or add another layer to that, when we're in a trap, we're being walked by our minds, And that usually takes us away from what's important to us. Avoiding applying for a job, perfectly understandable, makes us really anxious, but all the time it's maybe taking us away from what matters to us, taking away from getting the job that we want or need. Another example might be like the one we did earlier on in the seminar. If we're being pulled along by our thoughts and feelings, just doing a basic or practical thing, something that we need to do like going to a shop or a supermarket, very understandable putting it off if we think something awful is going to happen. But recognising that by avoiding, it's taking us away from something that's important, something that matters to us. In the example we gave, going to supermarkets was important because this person was quite sociable and friendly. So when we're in a track, again it's like taking your mind for a walk, and that's likely to be in the direction of toward what matters, toward your values. The thoughts and feelings again are unlikely to drop off straight away, but you can take them with you toward what's important to you. Just to finish off this seminar then, I'm just going to show a quick video clip which summarises some of the ideas that we've talked about in this session so far.
Imagine that you're steering a boat that's far, far out at sea. And below the deck of your boat, out of sight, lies a vast horde of demons. And they've all got enormous claws and razor-sharp teeth. And they've made a deal with you. As long as you keep your boat drifting aimlessly out at sea, and they'll stay beneath the deck so that you don't have to look at them. But if you ever decide to start heading towards shore, then they immediately rush up on the deck. And they'll flap their wings, bare their fangs, and threaten to tear you to shreds. Not surprisingly, you don't like that very much. So you say, "Sorry demons, I didn't mean it. Please, go back down below." Then you turn the boat around and drift back out to sea. And the demons disappear beneath the deck, out of sight again. So you breathe a sigh of relief, and everything seems okay. For a while. The problem is, you soon get fed up of drifting aimlessly. You start to get bored, lonely, miserable, resentful, anxious, depressed. You see all those other ships heading towards shore. And you know, actually, that's where you really want to be going. So one day, you pluck up the courage and turn the wheel and start heading towards shore again. But the moment you do, those demons swarm up on the deck again and threaten once again to rip you into pieces. But here's the interesting thing. Although these demons are very good at threatening you, they never actually cause you physical harm. And why not? Well, because they can't. All they can do is growl loudly, wave their claws and look terrifying. But physically, they can't touch you. The only power they have is the ability to intimidate. So, if you believe they're going to do what they say they're going to do, then they've really got control of the boat. But once you realise they can't actually do any physical harm, well, then you're free, as long as you're willing to accept the demon's presence. And all you have to do to reach land is let the demons gather round. Let them scream at you all they like, and keep steering the boat towards shore. The demons may howl and protest, but they're powerless to stop you.
And then finally, just to recap this seminar called Do What Matters, let's look at the main points. So what we've talked about is how life happens. It's often very hassly and stressful, and when it does, this affects what matters to us, and we experience unwanted thoughts and feelings. This is normal, and what often follows is we tend to avoid. Now, avoidance is normal, but if we do it too much, we can get out of the habit of doing what matters to us, and if we do that too much, we start to lose sight of what's important and what matters to us. By using some of the ideas and techniques that we've covered in the seminar today, it might help you to understand what's going on for you if you are caught up in an avoidance cycle, and trying to be a little bit more compassionate to yourself, maybe stepping out of this kind of self-critical thing that we can all do. Okay, so that's the end of the seminar, Do What Matters. As I said earlier, it's one of 3 seminars that we've produced for people on the waiting list for CBT. If you'd like to watch the other 2, if you haven't done already, please do, and feel free to watch this clip again, watch this seminar again, and perhaps find out the bits or focus on the bits that you found personally relevant or interesting. None of the things in the seminar we're saying are necessarily easy to do, but all the techniques that we've covered in this seminar, like all the techniques in all the seminars, are all evidence-based, and they're all known to work for some people. So the idea is to give them a try them out, and if they don't work, perhaps try something else. Really good luck with it.